I had exactly $11,842.17 left in my business operating account when my wife slapped me in front of 13 people for telling her mother she had no right to sell my late father's tools. My left arm was still in a sling from rotator cuff surgery, so I felt the hit in my jaw and all the way down my neck before I felt the embarrassment. 10 minutes later, while I was standing alone in the dark of my own garage trying to remember where I'd left my truck keys, I found a blue USB drive taped beneath my father's old workbench with my name written on it in block letters. By the end of that month, there would be an affidavit, a temporary restraining order, an asset freeze, and a courtroom so quiet I could hear somebody's bracelet knock against the counsel table. Let me take you back. My name is Mason Reed. I was 41 then, and I build custom cabinets and built-ins for people with nicer kitchens than mine. I live outside Tulsa, in a brick ranch house I bought with my father 3 years before I met my wife, Lena. The house mattered to me for a reason that would have sounded sentimental to most people and ridiculous to hers. My father and I had redone almost every inch of it together. He taught me how to square a doorway in that hallway, how to cut crown in the living room without cursing too much, how to look at a crooked room and not panic. My flaw, if I'm honest, is that I can tolerate too much for too long and then decide I'm done all at once. Lena liked to call that steadiness. Her mother, Denise, called it weakness when she thought I couldn't hear her. The dinner where everything broke was supposed to be small. Just family, Lena had said. That phrase should have come with a warning label. Just family, in her world, meant a full dining room, extra folding chairs, free casseroles, and Denise seated where my father used to sit, talking as if the house responded to her voice. I had been out of surgery for 9 days. I wasn't supposed to drive. I wasn't supposed to lift anything heavier than a coffee mug. I definitely wasn't supposed to host 14 people, but Lena had done that thing she'd gotten good at over the years, speaking about a decision in the tone people use after the decision has already been made. "It'll be good for you," she'd said that morning. "You've been moping." What she meant was that I had been noticing things. Notice how the utility bills kept climbing while her mother ran the heat like we lived inside a greenhouse. Notice how her younger brother Bryce, who had been between jobs for 16 months, always had money for rims, but never for groceries. Notice how Denise had started referring to my detached workshop as the back building, as if naming it differently made it less mine. Lena's parents had moved in after Denise's hip surgery 2 years earlier. That was supposed to last 6 weeks. Then Bryce came after his breakup. Then Lena's Aunt Joni started spending half the week there because it was easier for church. The arrangements expanded the way water stains do, quietly, then all at once. I kept peace because my father had died the year before and grief made the house feel too empty. A full house, even the wrong full house, can trick a man into thinking he's not alone. That night Denise was halfway through criticizing my business while passing the cornbread. If Mason learned how to scale properly, she said, he wouldn't have to worry every slow season. A real provider doesn't let his wife feel uncertainty. I was staring at the roast, trying not to answer. My shoulder throbbed. My pain medication had worn off an hour earlier, and somebody, probably Bryce, had moved my chair so there wasn't room for my sling. Then Denise said, "And once we sell some of Harold's old tools from the garage, that should cover part of the church donation Lena promised." I looked up. The room didn't move. It sharpened. "My father's tools?" I asked. Denise dabbed her mouth. "Nobody uses them. I use them." She gave that little smile some people mistake for manners. "You don't need 10 antique hand planes and rusty saws cluttering up space." I remember putting my fork down carefully. No one is selling anything that belonged to my father. Her face changed first. Then Lena's did. Denise leaned back. "You don't speak to me like that in my daughter's home." That was the sentence. That was the one. I heard myself say, very quietly, "This is not your daughter's home. And if I weren't covering half your family's life, maybe money wouldn't be such a dramatic topic at my table." The slap came before the last word had fully left the room. Lena stood beside me, breathing hard, palms still raised. Nobody else moved. Denise looked shocked for only a second, and then not shocked at all. Bryce actually smirked. Aunt Joni looked down at her plate. Lena said, "Do not ever disrespect my mother again." My cheek burned. What I remember most, though, was the silence after. The kind that shows you the actual shape of a room. No one asked if I was all right. No one told her she'd crossed a line. Her father, Martin, cleared his throat and said, "You owe Denise an apology." I touched my face, then looked at every person at that table. I saw leftovers they'd eaten, bills I'd paid, excuses I'd listened to, and all the little compromises I'd called temporary, because that was easier than calling them what they were. I stood up and said, "No." I went through the kitchen, down the hall, and into the garage because that was the only place in the house that still felt like mine. I intended to grab my keys, get in the truck, and sleep somewhere with a lock on the door. Instead, I noticed the dust pattern was wrong around my father's old bench. Somebody had been moving things. I crouched awkwardly with one good arm and found the USB drive taped underneath, right near the clamp rack. "Mason," that was all it said. Behind me, laughter drifted in from the dining room. Somebody asked for pie. I put the little drive in my pocket, grabbed an overnight bag, and left through the side door without another word. In the parking lot of a Hampton Inn, I borrowed the clerk's business center computer because I hadn't brought my adapter. The USB had 2 folders on it. The first was labeled Bank. The second was labeled Don't Trust the Notary. The first folder held scanned loan documents for something called Hearthline Family Living, LLC. I had never heard of it. There was a promissory note, a deed of trust, a personal guarantee, and something titled Spousal Consent and Member Resolution. My name appeared 3 times. So did a signature that looked enough like mine to fool a stranger and not nearly enough to fool me. The collateral listed on the deed of trust was my detached workshop and the quarter-acre behind it. I sat there staring at the screen until the desk clerk asked if I needed more time. The second folder changed everything. Inside it was a PDF of Denise's notary journal, photographed page by page, plus screenshots of emails between Lena and a loan officer at Red Prairie Community Bank. One email had been forwarded with the original metadata intact. It showed the file containing my signature had been created on Lena's laptop at 11:48 p.m. the night before my surgery, then modified at 6:12 a.m. from Denise's email account. There was also a voice memo. A woman's voice, older, tired, careful. "Mason, this is Nora Bell. You probably don't remember me, but I closed your father's refinance in 2018. Denise brought in a packet today and asked me a strange question about backdating acknowledgments. I told her no. If you get this, call your bank first thing in the morning. And don't sign anything." I knew Nora Bell. Or rather, I knew her face. She was a quiet woman from church who had bought built-ins from me 3 summers before. I hadn't known she worked in title compliance. I definitely hadn't known she was the one who had slipped the USB into my garage after someone apparently ignored her warning. At 7:08 the next morning, I called Red Prairie. The woman who answered transferred me to compliance, then to a man named Eric Whalen who sounded like he had been waiting for my call. "Mr. Reed," he said, "we were about to release the second disbursement on that file." "What file?" "The Hearthline Family Living commercial line. It's secured by an executed deed of trust on parcel 14B and the accessory structure. That deed is forged." There was a pause, then keyboard clicks. "Can you come in today? I can be there in 40 minutes. His voice lowered. "Mr. Reed, if you miss this, you lose everything." That sentence cut cleaner than panic. Deadlines are easier for me than emotions. I showered one-handed, drove badly, and got to the bank by 8:05. Eric met me in a glass room upstairs with a folder so thick it made my mouth go dry. He laid it out simply. Hearthline Family Living, LLC had been formed 6 weeks earlier by Lena and Denise. They had applied for a commercial line to convert my workshop into an assisted family residence for Denise and 2 elderly women from church. Their story was compassionate, polished, and almost certainly nonsense. They had submitted a member resolution claiming I had contributed the back parcel to the LLC. They had included notarized spousal consent, a forged signature, and property insurance quotes. The first draw, $84,000, had already gone into an escrow account controlled by the LLC. The second draw was scheduled that afternoon. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because Ms. Bell flagged irregularities," he said. "And because there are enough inconsistencies here that our counsel advised a hold if you appeared and disputed execution." I signed an affidavit on the spot stating the signatures were not mine. Eric copied my driver's license and asked whether I had been present before Denise when she notarized the documents. "No." "Had you ever consented to collateralizing your separate property?" "No." "Did you know about this LLC?" No, that was the first time that day I heard the phrase separate property. It steadied me. So did affidavit. So did hold. Words with edges. From the bank, I went straight to a lawyer named Ava Lynn. Nora Bell had recommended her through Eric. Ava was compact, direct, and the sort of person who kept her pen parallel to the desk when she wasn't using it. She read everything once without speaking. Then she looked at me and said, "All right, we have 3 lanes: civil injunction, fraud referral, and family court." I said, "Tell me in regular English." She almost smiled. A temporary restraining order stops them from moving money or touching the property while we sort this out. An asset freeze can lock the escrow and LLC accounts. In divorce court, we document financial misconduct so they can't turn your own earnings into leverage against you. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a second. I wanted to ask for counseling last month. "Not relevant," she said gently. "What matters now is paper." Then she pointed to the notary pages. Denise's acknowledgement is defective on its face. Wrong date format, missing seal impression on one copy, and the commission number doesn't match the county's current records. If that's really her notary commission, she may have used an expired seal. That's useful. What about Lena? Ava tapped the email printout. The metadata is better. People forge signatures. They forget computers keep time. I sat there listening while she explained a lease pendens, which is basically a public notice that property is in dispute so no one can quietly sell or refinance it. She explained escrow. She explained why separate property can stay separate in a marriage unless it's deliberately commingled or fraudulently transferred. She explained that if Lena had helped create false instruments during the marriage, a fraud carve-out in Oklahoma divorce cases could matter more than her family seemed to think. I remember asking, "Is this revenge?" And Ava said, "No, this isn't revenge. This is justice." That line stayed with me because it removed the heat from what came next. The ugly part was that none of this began with the forged deed. It began years earlier, in smaller humiliations I kept labeling as family friction. The first one I can picture clearly happened at my father's funeral reception. I was in the kitchen rinsing coffee cups when Denise stood in the doorway and said, "Harold loved me. He told me more than once Lena should make sure her name ends up on everything." It was 2 hours after we had buried him. I turned around and said, "This is not the time." She shrugged. There's never a convenient time with men who avoid paperwork. The second was 6 months later when Bryce backed his motorcycle into my truck and lied about it. I had the security footage. Lena watched it with me in the den. Then she said, "He's embarrassed. Do you really need to make this bigger?" I said, "He damaged my truck." She said, calm as weather, "And you can afford to fix it. Not everything has to become a principle." That was their genius. They treated my boundaries like preferences. Optional. Decorative. By the time of my surgery, the dehumanization had gotten efficient. Denise had started introducing me at church as our hard-working Mason, in the same tone people use for a dependable appliance. Martin used my tools, but never returned them to the rack. Bryce borrowed my debit card once by accident. Lena, when she needed money for her mother's prescriptions or her brother's insurance or some new emergency with no receipt, would come stand in the doorway of my office and wait until I looked up. She never yelled. She never had to. The week before surgery, while I was signing actual hospital forms with my actual signature, Lena slid a separate packet under my hand and said, "These are just intake duplicates." I was tired and hungry and irritated, and I signed 2 pages before I noticed one heading mentioned business operations. I stopped. She took the packet back too quickly and said the office had mixed forms. At the time, I let it pass. At Ava's office, looking at the forged loan packet, I finally understood what that moment had probably been: a failed attempt to get a clean signature sample under stress. Over the next 4 days, strategy replaced shock. Ava filed for divorce on grounds no fault, but with attached claims for dissipation, fraud, and exclusive use of the marital residence pending hearing because the residence had been funded and titled in my sole name before marriage. She sought a temporary restraining order against Lena, Denise, and Hearthline Family Living, LLC, prohibiting transfer, encumbrance, or occupancy changes concerning the workshop and parcel. Eric's bank counsel froze the escrow pending investigation. Nora Bell gave a sworn statement about Denise's request to backdate notarization. A forensic document examiner compared my authentic signatures to the forged ones and concluded the loan packet signatures were simulations assembled from at least 2 prior documents. The report even explained how one swoop from an old tax return, one tail from a permit application, combined, resized, and printed. Metadata. I had never respected metadata before. After that week, I practically wanted to frame it. Lena called 12 times the day she was served. I answered once. "Mason," she said, breathing hard. "What is wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me? This bank thing is a misunderstanding. My mother was trying to help us. By forging my name? You always make everything sound so ugly." I stood in Ava's hallway looking out at the parking lot. "Lena, did you create Hearthline?" Silence. Then, "It was supposed to help my mother. Did you sign my name?" More silence. "You're blowing up our marriage over paperwork," she said finally. "No," I said. "You blew it up over theft." She started crying then, but in a careful way, like she already knew someone might be listening. 2 days later came the social piece, the one that turned their private entitlement into a public performance. Our church hosted an annual donor supper in the fellowship hall. Lena's family had been talking for months about pitching a new elder care ministry there. That was the real purpose of Hearthline. Not care, money, sympathy, credibility. They wanted donors to believe the project already had land and family backing. I had no intention of going until Ava asked one question. "Will they use your property in the presentation?" I said, "Almost certainly." She said, "Then I want witnesses." So I went. The room smelled like coffee, pot roast, and floor polish. The pastor was there. So were half a dozen local business owners, the church treasurer, 2 women from the county board, and more people who knew my father than knew me. I sat near the back with Ava on one side and Nora Bell on the other. That was when I learned the full ally twist. Nora wasn't just a quiet client from church. She was the compliance director for the title company that handled most commercial closings in 3 counties, and she had already alerted the state notary administrator. She had the kind of calm that made bad people underestimate her. Denise took the microphone first. She was excellent for about 4 minutes. Warm voice, hand on heart, story about caring for elders, gratitude, sacrifice. Then a slide came up behind her, a rendering of my workshop, only they had relabeled it Hearthline Family Residence in a tasteful serif font. I felt Ava sit a little straighter. Denise said, "Thanks to family generosity, the property has already been committed," and that was where Ava stood. "Pastor," she said, not loudly, "before additional statements are made, I need to note on the record that the property shown is under active dispute, subject to a filed lease pendants as of this afternoon." The room shifted. People turned. Denise blinked. Lena, seated at table 3, went white. Ava kept going, still calm. "There is also a pending temporary restraining order regarding the use of Mr. Mason Reed's name, signature, and separate property in connection with Hearthline Family Living, LLC." That was the small reveal. The bigger one came from Nora. She stood only when Pastor Ellis asked whether there had been some misunderstanding. "No," Nora said. "Not from where I sit. Ms. Parker asked me to advise on a backdated notarization. I refused. The loan packet includes execution defects and file metadata inconsistent with lawful signing. I'd urge no one here to donate until independent counsel reviews every representation." The room got very quiet then, but not yet nuclear. Nuclear was Lena. She stood up too quickly, knocking her water glass over. "Mason, stop," she said. "Please." I looked at her. I hadn't raised my voice once. The county board woman at the front table asked, "Are you saying donor packets were circulated using disputed collateral?" Ava said, "Yes." The church treasurer, who apparently had already received a pledge sheet, pushed his chair back and said, "Then this meeting is over." Denise tried to reclaim the room. "This is a family matter being weaponized by a bitter husband." And before I could say a word, Pastor Ellis said, very evenly, "Forgery is not a family matter." That sentence landed harder than anything I could have delivered. People started leaving tables. One donor asked for his packet back. Another asked if law enforcement had been notified. Bryce cursed under his breath and stormed toward the exit. Lena sat back down and stared at the spilled water spreading into the tablecloth. I put the phone face down. Then I waited. The hearing on the temporary orders was the following Thursday. That week felt longer than some years. Lena's attorney made the predictable arguments. He said I had overreacted. He said Denise was an elderly woman trying to secure housing. He said Lena believed the property transfer was marital in nature and that any signature irregularity was a technical error. He suggested I had emotionally abandoned the residence after my surgery and was now using superior finances to punish dependent relatives. Ava let him finish. Then she started laying brick. First, the deed and mortgage history proving I bought the house and workshop before marriage with my father, with no later transfer deed adding Lena. Second, my affidavit denying execution. Third, the forensic report explaining simulated signatures. Fourth, Nora's sworn statement about the backdating request. Fifth, the bank compliance memorandum placing the second disbursement on hold due to suspected fraud. Sixth, the donor slide deck from the church supper using my property image and claiming commitment. The judge asked Lena directly, "Did you know this property was titled solely in Mr. Reed's name?" Lena said yes. "Did you obtain his written consent to pledge it?" She hesitated. Her lawyer started to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "Mrs. Reed," Lena swallowed. "I thought we were doing it for the family." It was not an answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Then Denise made the mistake that ended whatever sympathy remained. She interrupted from the gallery and said, "He would have signed if he weren't so selfish." The courtroom went silent. Not polite silent, alarmed silent. The judge looked over his glasses and said, "Bailiff, if Ms. Parker speaks again, remove her." After that, the rest came quickly. The temporary restraining order was granted. Hearthline's accounts and escrow were frozen pending further proceedings. Lena was barred from representing any ownership interest in the property. Denise's notary conduct was referred to the appropriate state office. I was granted exclusive control over the workshop and associated parcel. In the divorce matter, the judge noted on the record that there was preliminary evidence of financial misconduct relevant to equitable distribution. Outside the courthouse, Lena caught up to me on the steps. She looked smaller without an audience. "Mason," she said, "my mother is terrified." I said, "She should have been careful. You're enjoying this." "No," I said truthfully. "I'm exhausted." She stared at me for a second like she had never seen me clearly before. Then she said, "You always cared more about property than people." That might have hurt once. By then it just sounded like language borrowed from someone else's mouth. I said, "No, I cared about being treated like a person inside my own life." She cried. I didn't. That detail matters to me because I used to think the person who cried first was automatically the one in pain. It turns out some people cry when consequences arrive. Once the temporary orders were in place, everything unraveled with surprising speed. The bank formally denied the Hearthline line and began its internal fraud review. The state suspended Denise's notary commission pending investigation. 2 church donors requested written clarification from the pastor. Bryce moved out within a week because there was no project anymore, no easy money attached to the illusion. Martin found part-time work with a roofing crew. Aunt Joni vanished back to whatever house she had always had. Lena stayed at the property for another 10 days until Ava negotiated a move-out protocol. That part was oddly civilized. Times for pickup, list for disputed personal property, a deputy present for the larger items. It felt like dismantling a stage set after the audience had gone home. The final divorce settlement came 3 months later. No alimony, no claim to the workshop, limited division of actual marital property, mostly furniture and one joint account. Lena's attorney pushed once for reimbursement based on improvements made during the marriage. Ava answered with receipts showing most improvements had been paid from my separate funds or directly tied to my business, plus the unresolved fraud conduct. The push stopped. I learned one more thing during settlement that almost made me laugh. My father's estate plan, which I had barely reviewed after his death because grief and paperwork are bad companions, contained an irrevocable trust holding a small investment account. It wasn't a fortune, but there was a canary clause in the trust instructions, a plain language provision my father had added after helping a friend through an ugly inheritance fight. If any beneficiary or spouse attempted to obtain trust-connected property through fraud, concealment, or false instrument, that person's contingent benefit was cut off entirely. Lena had never known she was a remote contingent beneficiary of that small account through me. By participating in the forged property scheme, she erased even that. It was such a Harold Reed move that I sat in Ava's office smiling for the first time in weeks. My dad really wrote that. I asked. Ava slid the page toward me. Your father had range. The settlement was signed the next day. 1 year later, the house was quiet in the best possible way. I had refinished the dining table. Not because it needed it, but because I did. Denise's chair was back in the garage where it belonged. My shoulder had healed enough that I was working full days again, though I was smarter about it. I'd taken fewer jobs and better ones. I slept more. I cooked in my own kitchen and left exactly 1 coffee cup in the sink when I felt like it. The workshop stayed a workshop. On Saturday mornings I opened the side door, let the light come in, and used my father's hand planes one by one. Not because they were precious museum pieces, because they still worked. I ran into Lena once that fall at a pharmacy on Sheridan. She looked tired, but steadier than the last time. We stood near the greeting cards like 2 people waiting for weather to pass. She said, "My mother still says you ruined her life." I said, "Did I?" Lena gave a tired little smile. "No. I think she was always going to end up here. I just helped her get there." That was the most honest thing she ever said to me. I told her I was sorry for the pain, but not for the boundary. She nodded like she already knew that was the only answer I had. Then we wished each other well, and that was it. People like big endings. Explosions. Confessions. Somebody falling apart in public. Real life is usually quieter than that. Justice, when it finally arrives, often sounds like a copier, a courtroom clerk, a lawyer explaining a deadline, or a judge telling someone to answer the question they were hoping to avoid. What I learned was simpler than the legal file made it look. If a person needs your silence to keep taking from you, they do not love your peace. They love your access. And if you keep confusing endurance with kindness, eventually someone will invoice you for your own home. So I stopped doing that. I kept the house. I kept the workshop. I kept my name where it belonged. Most importantly, I kept my self-respect. And that turned out to be worth a lot more than $11,842.17. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, which one did you protect first? And if this story hit home for you, subscribe and stay with me for the next one.